So I think this is going to be a yearly thing now. Every year I'm going to do a report on New Genesis, and possibly also PSO2, or maybe even talking about other Phantasy Star games. Last year I did this for my magazine, this year it's a video, next year, who knows what I'll be doing. But because I don't expect everyone to go back and read the magazine articles I wrote, even though the links are in the description, let's go over the first year of NGS. The game lost, honestly, transparently unfinished, although I am willing to be a bit forgiving here. It was 2021 after all, and it's a Japanese game. Development must have been rocky, and it's not like there were many other games, especially Japanese games, that did better that year. Monster Hunter Rise stands out as a similar game that launched a few months earlier and was also very conspicuously unfinished at launch. As for the game itself, it honestly mostly just felt like base PSO2, but with less. The only real addition was the open world, which mostly feels like a gimmick. I mean, it's better than many other open worlds, there's at least things to explore and find, but it still kind of feels like a gimmick. The gameplay felt more simplistic than base PSO2. Often, combat will devolve into just floating in front of your target's weak spot, performing the same basic loop over and over. Or if you're fighting large groups, spamming the same area of effect photon art over and over. And fighting with a party only makes it worse. There's little sense of teamwork unless your class happens to be one of the ones with support abilities, and with the raw power of a full team, you can steamroll most normal enemies. Bosses, meanwhile, end up feeling incredibly static out of a need to actually stand up to a full party for an extended period. Almost every boss feels like you're fighting a brick wall. At the same time, there was less content in NGS, and a lot of that content in the first year wasn't that good. Kavaris, the area added in the big anniversary update, was particularly lacking. Its story amounted to nothing more but pure filler, and the gameplay areas were a bit lacking as well. Perhaps worst of all is the focus on gacha stuff and the battle passes. It feels nearly like a mobile game at times, with actual gameplay that is secondary to getting the players to pay up. And the greatest weakness of all this? You can transfer between base PSO2 and NGS through the block change menu, using the same character for each. It's why I compare NGS to base PSO2 so much. I can't really separate the two when they're within the same game. So for this video I'm going to try something a bit different. I'm going to narrate my experience with the game and use that to branch off into different topics about the game. So a few days before the anniversary update, I decided to log back into NGS to get caught up and ready for the update. So I boot up Delta, the cast girl I will be playing as, and get to work. So first, while I don't have footage of it, logging in I got bombarded with stuff. Your usual login bonus, plus a bunch of events quests appearing and being cleared because they're based on story progress, as well as several bits of dialogue for new quests. This happened last year too. It feels like I'm just immediately hit with sensory overload, and I'm not a fan of this. Then I had to deal with some inventory woes before realizing I could just spend some soul gems on material storage, and that just solved everything. Aside from gambling for cosmetics, making you desperate for more inventory space is one of the main ways this game tries to get you to shell out. The first thing I decided to do is change my class. I've stuck with Braver for a while now, and since I also played Braver before getting a Scion class in regular PSO2, I need a change. And conveniently, there's two new classes. One is pretty much just PSO2 Summoner with a new name, although I think it might also lack some of the more in-depth mechanics. I don't play either, so don't expect a comparison here. And the other is a specialist in gunblades, a weapon that was in PSO2 at launch. This does bring NGS closer to parity at least, but it does still get overshadowed by the fact that NGS is still clearly playing catch-up to what base PSO2 had. But hey, gunblades are cool, and I like a blend of melee and range. I mean, I was playing Braver after all, so I go for Slayer. So after getting decked out in a mix of old gear and random crap from PSO2, now I need to figure out what I'm actually going to do. First, I end up going to one of the combat areas to do some farming and find out a couple of things. First, NPCs populate the areas now, which always feels a bit desperate to cover for the lack of people, especially in lower level areas. Honestly, I always had a strange fondness for the feeling of venturing into these areas alone, but I would find out later that you can turn this off, so if it does bug you, that's fine. The second thing I remember is that this game can be a little brutal on your hands. With a few rounds done, I see that there's an idol concert coming up, so I go to have a sit down and type up some of my notes. I have a decent stock of side quests, but I'll really have to wander around to pick up some more. I also saw a guy with some character quests. That is interesting, so I'll have to take a look at that later. Retum is probably my favorite hub, so spending time here is always nostalgic for me. Another issue I see that feels common to this game, and sadly MMOs in general, is that there often feels like there's an overemphasis on complexity rather than depth. I keep finding more and more new systems that are just yet another thing to try and keep track of, although admittedly PSO2 base is even worse about this. After the concert, I do a bit more grinding. Just look at this. This kind of sums up a lot of my issues with the game. It's just such sensory overload. There's always so much going on, and the auto-collect items means there's a constant stream of stuff flowing into your inventory, and yet the combat is pretty much just button mashing. It all ends up just kind of blurring together into, honestly, just a very samey sort of mush. So I skip over a few days here because there's not a lot that I do besides grinding. I did end up having fun with it though, and I even found myself joining an alliance. Also, I did find myself falling in love with the Slayer class enough to bother to grind that up to the point where I can do the new content. Really, Slayer and its gunblades are one of the big reasons I've enjoyed returning to this game. While it's a bit lacking as a new feature, since gunblades were already in base PSO2 and they already had a Scion class focusing on them, it's still pretty fantastic by the standards of NGS classes. It only has the one weapon type, but there is a lot more depth to the weapon class than most others. While most weapons have one option for a given situation, Slayers will usually have a few different things that they can consider using, and pretty much every action has multiple layers to it. The normal attacks are 3 gunshot combos that, with a skill, deal more damage in close range. You can also perform a charge shot for either a rapid fire or explosive shot. And if you tap normal attack during a photon art, you can cause a hit to deal more damage, while hitting it after a photon art will cause you to fire off an additional boosted shot. These features add a frantic, combo-centric feel to the class. The weapon action is a sword slash that can be turned into a moving slash. Either of these offer iframes to allow you to defend yourself and deal powerful counterattacks. Additionally, if you fire a charged normal attack and then perform a weapon action at the right time, you'll teleport to the target for a powerful slash. This is a great gap closer, and it also can parry and counterattacks. Perhaps one of the most fun traits of Slayer is that, like many Scion classes in base PSO2, each of its photon arts has 2 different versions. If you activate the photon art while inputting a direction, it completely changes what it does. As a result, there's a lot more room for each photon art to be a bit more specialized, and there's a lot more viable photon arts as a result, keeping Slayer combat relatively varied and exciting, especially when combined with the way you need to weave normal attacks into your photon art. There's also the active skills. One is a pretty standard super mode, though one that does require you to fill up your combo meter first, while the other is a powerful attack that's charged up by photon arts. Giving the player a reason to try and use photon arts as much as possible is actually important here because, unlike many classes, it has very powerful normal and weapon action abilities. While admittedly Slayer is still a bit simple compared to base PSO2 classes, by the standards of what I've played in NGS, it really stands out. It's fast, it's exciting, and it's a bit more involved to play. But now let's get back to the game. Let's try and start on the quest for the volcanic area. If I can get to even a fairly early point in it, I should be able to get a huge windfall of EXP that will help me catch up to be where I need to be for the new update. And so, after exploiting both the powering level quest from Gaiden and the event shop that sells near endgame gear, I'm all set to go to Stia. And I love it. I love how you start at this beach to explore and then slowly move into the volcanic area. I love how the steep cliffs make the area feel more focused and contained. It reminds me a lot of Monster Hunter's volcano areas, which are always some of the best volcanoes in games. And I love how the camp looks almost like a real place. The towns in NGS really suffer from feeling artificial, like they're places that exist only for gameplay purposes, so even the slightest hint of feeling like a real place is an improvement. And the story in this area will be about actually fighting the enemy, not just the filler family drama that Kavaris was. And as I continue to progress through the missions, I find I am really enjoying Stia. The areas continue to be varied with factories and fields of lava. Volcanoes can easily end up being boring and monotonous, but this game does them right. Probably the best volcano areas since Monster Hunter. And there's an actual plot here. I mostly remember Kavaris being a wild goose chase to find the person I'm actually looking for, all to do something that doesn't actually get any payoff during the Kavaris storyline. Stia, meanwhile, you have a clear mission that you accomplish in steps. You have to get to a place to fight Dark Falls, and the story along the way is you actively working towards that goal. Not to mention there's some actual character writing again. The leader of the region is important to the plot instead of being a living plot device. And he has a personality and a history with Crawford, the leader of Central, whose orders you've been following this entire game. I realize this kind of feels like storytelling 101, but I've learned not to take anything for granted when it comes to video game plots, especially this one. And the plot also dives into the dolls and Dark Falls a bit more. They were only ever generic monsters before. We don't get a ton about them, but we finally start to see locations related to them. It's the best plot of any chapter in this story so far, as is fitting for the build-up to the finale of the first story arc. And unlike previous chapters, there's no waiting for an urgent quest. The finale to the solo story mode is a solo mission, which I find out later does get an expanded version for the urgent quest, which is exactly how this should be handled. It always seems weird to me when online games have story modes that are mostly single-player experiences, but then have their climaxes as multiplayer-only content. It really just breaks the flow of things. Admittedly, thanks to getting boosts from the anniversary event, I was able to fly through things pretty quickly without having to stop and grind, so my experience with Stia might have been improved by that. But regardless, after completing Stia, I am surprised quite pleasantly by the start of Chapter 5. This answers a lot of questions that had been set up, both through the narrative and through elements of gameplay in the world, surprisingly. It turns out there's a real in-universe reason behind some of the more artificial elements of the game, and it's also definitely setting up for future story arcs. I'm not going to spoil what actually happens though. It's a lot shorter than prior arcs with no filler grinding. It's really just the good stuff, building up to an incredible final mission. This is it. NGS is good now. Honestly, this is a lot like base PSO2. The first part of the story was long, dull, and didn't seem to go anywhere until the end. Then it had a weird sort of epilogue thing that seemed to do most of the work setting up later storylines, but Chapter 1 had to crawl so that later story arcs could run. And boy did Chapters 2 and 3 run. So I am starting to have faith that NGS will do the same. And then after completing this finale, that was all I managed to get done. I wish I had gotten to do more, but by the time I had finished it was late into the night before maintenance. and maintenance started early the following day, so this was all I had time to do before the big update. I was going to go over all the changes in the big update, but I realized that would be honestly a whole bunch of filler, and all the interesting stuff gets talked about later on anyway. The big thing is they're speeding up leveling and reducing the mandatory grinding by removing battle power gates from the story quests, which is good. I hated those. Really, battle power is one of my least favorite mechanics in this game, and it's one of the ones that makes it feel most like a mobile game. It takes an already too shallow game and encourages you to think even less. Don't think about what would be the most effective based on the various trade-offs. Just pick the thing that makes this one number the biggest. I don't like that. I enjoy RPG mechanics for the varied and complex interactions, not for the dopamine hit of seeing number get bigger. But anyway, now let's log on. I check some stuff out, and then I get sidetracked by creative space and an urgent quest. I also saw that advancing the plot is going to automatically clear side quests and these side stories. I'm a bit worried about the side quests, but well, they're not that important generally, but I will do the side stories. So let me take care of them and also talk about them. These side stories were added before the version 2 update, but I didn't have time to get to them. And they're really neat. They definitely were hamstrung for me by being added in later though. They're clearly meant to be experienced along with the main plot as you progress through the story. If I had experienced them as I went, I am sure they would have given me a much more enjoyable experience with the game and its story. Alright, so bit of a time jump there. I also decided to finish up all the side quests, you know, just because it scared me a little bit, and I'm really picky about really wanting to experience the content, and I don't want to miss out on anything. And you know, while I was there, I wanted to not waste the XP, so I put it into a class I didn't play, and then I had to grind a bit to jump certain gaps to run certain content with it. So anyway, I made up for skipping the grinding when I actually played through Stia. And coincidentally, I now have 3 classes at level 70. The side quests in Stia are fine, by the way. Nothing special, but nothing terrible. Okay, so going forward with the story, that was just a couple cutscenes. I guess I'm gonna have to wait a few more days for the actual update. See you after the cut. Okay, now it's been a few more days. Let's just take a look at the main tasks and... Wait, what? There's nothing. There is no new story. Just new enemies and combat sectors. The worst part of the game. Well, I guess I can get this video done sooner. At least the leveling experience to 75 was nice and quick. I got it done in one night. Unfortunately, the only new content to go with the level cap increase is these combat sectors and higher tier versions of the Dark Falls urgent quests, the Dark Falls Intercept and Battle of Halfa Lake. They're fairly doable even on the first night of the update. As people start to get better armor and 9-star weapons, they really won't be anything special at all. The most I can say now is that Dark Falls Aegis is a bit of a slog due to having too much HP, and the DPS checks are kind of a hassle. So let's talk about combat sectors. The millstone around this game's neck. I don't like them very much. Could you tell? They're about one step better than grinding random encounters in a traditional JRPG in terms of grind quality. They streamlined the grind to the point of removing almost all the parts that made any sort of grind in a game interesting. For those that don't play Phantasy Star Online 2, but for some reason have watched this long, well, they're basically specific zones in the open world dedicated to combat, you know, hence the name. You're pointed towards some monsters to kill, so you run to them, and then kill more. Occasionally a trial will pop up and you'll fight something tougher, and every so often you'll trigger a PSE burst and then a PSE climax that spawns a lot of enemies and then a boss. These tend to be the most profitable parts of grinding these areas. Problem tends to come into the fact that you can have up to 8 players in a combat sector, when usually any one of these players could solo most of this content. This results in big brawls becoming a chaotic mess where really everyone is just spamming their best AoEs as you and other players kill most enemies before they can do anything. Even bosses tend to drop pretty quickly against 8 players going all out. As a result, you have a horde of players simply running moving from spot to spot, killing everything. Then a PSE burst happens, a lot of enemies are dropped on them, and then there's a PSE climax and they kill a boss. And then they're immediately directed to the next point to start killing again. Compare this to PSO2's quests. They are functionally similar. Kill enemies until you get to the boss, then start a new quest and repeat. But PSO2 has small complications along the way. You're not just following a marker and killing things along the way, you have to actually explore and find the route further in. You have to take a moment to stop and pick up items. There's the lull as you enter the room with the boss teleporter, and when you clear the quest, you have a moment of triumph to enjoy and relax before you start a new quest. It's not just constant pressure to advance and fight and advance and fight and don't stop to think, just keep fighting. Oh, and the random events are also more varied in base PSO2. On paper, it does sound like combat sectors removed a lot of inconveniences, and that's probably what the developers thought they were doing. But the end product is bland, and by removing friction, they also removed texture. Worse still, it's mindless. You rush from marker to marker, spam attacks until you win, and then repeat. It is perhaps the most monotonous grind of any MMO I've ever played. It's maybe one step better than standing in one place, killing endlessly respawning enemies. You're moving from place to place, killing endlessly respawning enemies. Woo. It really doesn't have to be like this. Urgent quests prove that the game can have good content for 8-player groups, and the new Sonic Limited Time quest may be hamstrung by the competitive element they forced into it, but it's pretty unique. These sorts of things are my favorite part of NGS, but combat sectors do none of the things that make them good. But before we conclude, let's talk a bit about creative spaces. This is perhaps the biggest reason to play NGS over base PSO2. It's something NGS has that base doesn't. Creative spaces are an extremely robust and addictive building system. How robust and addictive? Yeah, I built all this. It's still a work in progress, but I've been busy. There aren't too many building games with a sci-fi style. Most tend towards fantasy, so this one really stands out as a result and I appreciate it. Honestly, I've gotten more into this than many actual standalone building games. I've never built anything like this in Minecraft or the like. Honestly, the biggest issue with it is probably that the system is too in-depth. There's no simple mode for it if you want to just place a few pieces of furniture in a pre-built building. As is often the case, the more powerful a tool is, the harder it is for new users. But if you can push past it to scale the learning curve, you can get really creative in this. Plus, the base area is just beautiful. Just take a look at some of these screenshots. Sometimes I just hang out with people and enjoy the views. Maybe pose for some screenshots. Considering that most of the game doesn't feel particularly social, these are a great change of pace. But as for the rest of the game, New Genesis is in a difficult spot. If you've played it before and liked it, but have since lapsed, it's worth coming back to, especially if, like me, your last experience was Chapter 3. Chapters 4 and 5 are a massive improvement, both in story and gameplay, and the Slayer class is awesome. Wicker might also be good, haven't tried it yet. There's also been some good quality of life improvements, like free skill point respecs. I never thought I'd see this game add something for free that you used to have to pay for. Come to think of it, the player housing in base PSO2 was also a paid service, so creative spaces being free is a nice improvement. And speaking of, creative spaces feel like they've finally given the game something where it actually excels over base PSO2, completely outclassing the player housing in that game. However, outside of creative spaces, the anniversary update is pretty lacking. The new content is almost entirely recycled, and there's about 5 minutes of added story. Unfortunately, if you have played the game since Chapter 4, or especially Chapter 5, there's not a lot to draw you back. Okay, so I'm adding this to the script later. At the start of July, there will be an update that adds a new urgent quest based on the boss at the end of Chapter 5. It's not a lot, it's still kind of recycled, but it's closer to new content than anything we got in the anniversary update. At least now there will be a reason to care about the new endgame. And if you didn't like the game before, there is little to change your mind. Although the version 2 title might make it sound like this is trying to be the Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn of this game. It's really not, no matter how much I feel like this game might sorely need a Realm Reborn style refresh. In fact, it's a pretty sparse update. I think the version 2 name is frankly a mistake. This is already barely passable as a major anniversary update, so calling it version 2 just sets expectations that the update does not meet. But even though version 2 was a disappointment, chapters 4 and 5 were great. I do think that New Genesis is finally worth playing. Now it feels a lot more presentable than it was at launch. It still has some fundamental flaws, don't get me wrong, but if you haven't tried it or haven't played it in a long time, it's worth giving a shot. But now there's one more question. What about the other game attached to the NGS? What about base PSO2? Well, this is already the longest video I've done, so we're gonna cover that one next time. Although I do want to finish the story before I do that, so I might have another video or two for you, just so that it doesn't take 3 months to get to the next video. But that's it for this video. Check out some of my other stuff, and I will see you next time.